My name is Adams, and I would like to welcome all of you to our lecture on spiritual discovery with Tom Maxwell, sponsored by the Christian Science Church in Lexington. I'm new to Christian Science and have found it inspiring to attend weekly Bible studies in Christian Science reading in Lexington. This evening, our speaker, Tom Maxwell, is going to take us on a spiritual journey of discovery. He is a Christian Science practitioner. Tom prays for people from many walks of life, helping them to find spiritual solutions to their problems, from healthcare concerns, relationship difficulties, and financial concerns. Tom started his career in finance. At the same time, volunteered as a prison chaplain in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office and youth in correctional facilities to find spiritual solutions in their lives. Tom has spoken throughout the United States as well as Europe, Africa, and Australia in prisons, universities, and government organizations on the subject of Christian Science and healing. Please help me to welcome our speaker, Tom McElroy.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Great to spend this evening with you. Thank you so much for coming out. Our subject, spiritual discovery, how you can better the world. I just want to say up front that I hope this will feel like a conversation among friends. It's a kind of a grand title, but I want you to know we're going to talk about it with just humility tonight. It's just kind of going to be an exchange of ideas, hopefully. I'm going to tell you some stories about some people that I've met along the way, as well as a little bit about myself and how some of the ideas that we're exploring have helped make a difference for the better in people's lives and help them help others. We're going to kind of break this up into 3 or so sections, talk a little bit about that phrase, spiritual discovery, which is in the title, and what that even means. We'll talk about its relationship with healing and really what healing is. Then we'll talk a little bit about, just kind of give some context to this approach, talk about the movement that's behind this, the movement of Christian Science, and its founder, Mary Baker Eddy. We'll talk a little bit more about the application of these ideas to healing, spiritual healing. And then we'll broaden it out and talk a little more about how we can see this having an impact on the wider world for the better. It may seem like that comes at the end, but hopefully by the end you'll see how everything we've talked about builds to help give us the kind of perspective that helps us help others. So we're not kind of just talking about the world at the end. It's really everything we're talking about is about that, as well as how we help ourselves. So the first thing I want to do is just tell you a story about my life. This is kind of a two-part story. It starts when I was it kind of starts before I was in high school. I was raised in a family that had a lot of troubles, financial difficulties and other things. My parents got divorced when I was about 12, and my mom and I went to live with my grandfather. The reason I tell you that is because in high school I was going along okay, and then one day I met a counselor as just part of the regular program. I wasn't seeking specific help, but the counselor started asking me questions about what my life was like growing up, and as I shared some things and opened up a little, the conversation ended with this counselor giving me a kind of prognosis and saying that I was going to have self-confidence issues, problems in relationships, and some other things kind of along those lines. That was pretty depressing to me. I really took that on, and I had this sense of my life as like, oh gosh, really kind of cause and effect, right? I went through this stuff, and that apparently is going to cause this effect in my life. And as things started feeling darker for me, a couple months went by, and I remember at one point just sitting on the couch alone in my house, and the thought came to me, though, that there might be another way to look at things. And this is not the deepest thought in the world, so just prepare you in case you're thinking it's going to be. We build slowly here. The thought was simply, you know what? You were a pretty happy kid when you were growing up, even though things were difficult. And actually, you were going along okay until you got this news that you weren't going to go along okay. So if you could be happy even when the toughest stuff was happening, why can't you be happy now when it's not even happening anymore? Like I said, not the deepest thought in the world, but it was enough to make me question. And that was kind of the bottom line. It was also a feeling. With that question came what felt kind of like a break in the clouds and a little bit of light. It felt like there was something beyond just the way I had started to see myself and things around me. And so the idea that I was asking what is that beyond the clouds, and having had a genuine feeling that there is something there, was really why that was a pivotal moment for me. Things bounced back for me pretty quickly. I didn't necessarily have it all figured out, but it was enough to know there was more, and implicitly I thought, okay, something else defines me. It's not just what this person has told me. There's something more to me, more to all of us. And that, again, was not necessarily a conscious thought, but implicit enough that it got me going. Soon after that, though, I started kind of trying to take it even further and think, okay, well, if there's more that defines me, and I don't have to just be defined by the past, I got into a little bit of a self-help kind of mode. Again, I wasn't using those words, but it was more like the model of I can make my destiny. And I thought, well, if I want to be somebody, if I want to have good in life, if I want to be secure in the future, if I want to be happy and be able to trust that, if I want to be a person of value in the world, then I have to make my way in the world. And so I started pursuing a model that's pretty common. It's not going to sound all that new to you. It was get the best grades, get the best kind of resume possible to put together for an application to get into the best kind of school possible, so that you can get into the right kind of course of study, get the right kind of job, make the right kind of money, meet the right kind of people, and so on. And so I did my best at that for the rest of my high school years. I did get pretty good grades. I was captain of the tennis team. I was in school government. I started the philosophy club. I had a job I was working at the same time. I got a black belt in Taekwondo. I was head of the local youth Masonic organization. Did community service projects. Some of it was authentic. Some of it was just to try and impress people who I thought were going to be the gateway to all those qualities and characteristics of life that I was yearning for. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Okay, so it's not so strange. And fast forward, I graduated from high school. In a moment of authenticity, I actually decided to go to a small liberal arts college. But when I got there, I picked up pretty much where I had left off. In fact, it was almost worse, because there was even less in what I was doing that was truly authentic to me. I would say 95% of it was just about impressing other people. And I was going along like that. I was running kind of ragged, and then at the end of my first semester in college, I got really sick. I ended up in the on-campus care facility, and it's not clear what I had. I was never diagnosed. I was tested for tuberculosis because I had symptoms that were similar to that. The results came back negative. I did not have tuberculosis, but again, it was never clear beyond that what it was. Whatever it wasn't feeling great, and I didn't seem to be doing well, and there was a lot of people that were concerned around me. I asked in this time frame a woman to pray with me, a Christian Science practitioner. Again, we're going to talk about prayer and healing and spirituality and all these words as we go along, but I'll just kind of tell you this story, how it happened first. I asked this woman to pray with me, and I don't remember much of anything we talked about until one day, about 2 weeks into this, she said to me, kind of out of the blue, if you get better, you don't have to go back. Now, as far as I know, I hadn't expressed any discontent with my life or the way I was handling things. But in that moment, it was another one of those moments like on the couch where the clouds kind of parted. This time it felt like a big door opening, and there was a way, a way to get out. I remember calling my mom and saying, "What do you think? Can I just quit school? Is that okay?" Now, for a kid who grew up pretty poor and had sort of put everything into, like, your future's riding on your education, to call up and say, "Can I just quit?" Scholarships and all that out the door. It felt like a big conversation, but my mother was very supportive, and she just said, "You do whatever you need to do." So I did leave school, but before I even got home, like within a couple days, my health had fully recovered. When I got home and I started thinking about things, again, it was with those kind of clouds parting, I started questioning again. Well, how did that happen? What is that about? If I want to get out, what is it that I really want? Where is all the good that I'm searching for going to come from, if not that model? And that led me to some of the next things that we're going to talk about. But I'll finish the story just by saying that not only did my health recover, but I realized school was not the problem. It was the way I was going about it. I went back to school. I changed my major. I changed almost everything that I was doing, and got on a different track. And that health issue never came back for me again. I never experienced any of those symptoms again. So, okay, let's pause there for a minute. First, let's pause on the word prayer. I told you that in this circumstance, I asked this woman to pray for me. When Jesus in the Bible is asked, "How do you pray?" People come to Jesus and say, "How do you pray?" as it's told in the Bible. The first thing Jesus says is, "Go into your closet." Now, I'm not here to define anything of what was said in the Bible, but I can talk about one way that I think we could look at it. And to me, it's a little bit like take a step back for a minute. Go into your closet, like take a step back from fear. Take a step back from your preconceived notions, like in my situation. Take a step back from maybe the opinions swirling around you. Take a step back from just the surface level appearance of things. So take a step back is the first thing that comes out of his mouth when he's asked, "How do you pray?" And then he goes on to give what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer talks about the nature of God. It talks about our relationship with God. And it talks about what that means for us. We're not going to deconstruct the whole prayer, but let's look at the broad brushstrokes there. Jesus is asked, "How do you pray?" He says, take a step back from the fear, the reactions, the surface appearance of things, and get focused on the nature of God and your relationship with God. Okay, so if we're going to pursue this, if we're going to understand a little bit more about prayer and what happened in that experience, let's talk about the word God. Take a step back. Okay, we get that. God, what is God? Well, it's an infinite subject by nature. One way Jesus talked about God is as spirit. A spirit, the word that's used in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, is the same word for wind. So there's a relationship there with that sense of something that you can't see, but you can feel, or you can see the effect of it. Jesus carries the analogy forward when he talks about God as spirit by talking about how you can't see the wind, you don't know where it's coming or going, but you can see the leaves rustling in the trees. So you can't see God, but you can feel God, or you can see the effect of God. The Bible talks about God as love itself. One of Jesus' primary followers, John, said, "God is love." The Bible says that God is truth itself, and life itself, and the source of all wisdom and all intelligence. In fact, it says everything that was made by God, and nothing was made that God didn't make, and that God is of purer eyes than to behold evil. So the idea that this single source, the single creator, the single cause is pure good, is pure love itself, is the very truth of the universe, is the very principle of the universe, if you will, because it's that sole cause, that sole source of the rules, the laws, the way things work. So if that's what God is, not like in the movies, you know, a lot of great actors have played God, but for all of them, they all at the end of the day are kind of like just a person up in the clouds that, you know, does some good over here and maybe can't or allows not good over here. There's been an evolution of the people's idea of God over time. You even see that in the Bible. You see people talking about God like a tribal leader, our God, but not their God, or our God will destroy them over there. But I do think in this evolution, it culminates in what you see expressed in the life of Jesus, what you see when the people who followed him really went out and talked about God as love itself, not a respecter of any particular group or class of persons, but truth for everybody, love for everybody, life for everybody. It's the rain that falls on everyone equally, the sun that shines on everyone equally. This broadened idea of God. Well, okay, so if that's God, and this prayer that Jesus gave us talks about our relationship with God, let's talk about that for a second. What is our role in this? How do we relate to God? Well, this is such an important point that it's one of the very first things that the Bible starts with. And the Bible, we're going to be drawing on it all evening, so I'm just going to say up front, I told you there's an evolution of the people's idea of God. And just in case you don't know the Bible, I know some of you do, and some of you may not know it very well, but the Bible's made up of a lot of different books. Letters, poems, songs, written by men and women, rich and poor, even different ideas about God. But some of these threads go through it that tie it all together, and one of them has to do with how when people get some concept of God, some new inspiration in regard to God and their relationship with God, it makes a tangible difference in their life. You see people in the middle of war finding safety, people in the middle of famine finding a way to eat, people kicked out of their communities finding a way to connect and have a community again, even people who are labeled incurable as finding health and wholeness again. But this theme of how we relate to God, what our relationship is with God, is there throughout all these different stories, all these different ideas about things. It kind of comes down to that. In these tough situations, people's idea of God suddenly changes their outlook on things. It changes their sense of who they are and what they have and what they can do. And then it leads to this effect that I was talking about of safety or health or so forth and so forth. So it's a theme that runs all throughout it, and so it's not surprising to me then that you find it, as I said, right up front, like on page 2, talking about us and our relationship with God. It says that we're made in the very likeness of God. And I'm going to read you one other line that relates in particular to the experience that I had. This is from the book of Isaiah. It says, "Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." Okay, so sons from far away, daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who's called by my name, formed and made by God. That all sounds pretty good, right? And it's inclusive. There's nobody in that sons from far away, daughters from the ends of the earth that doesn't sound like they're part of this, right? But who heard the reason why? What's the purpose of it all? Did you catch it? For my glory, right? Made for the glory of God. So let's pause on that for a second. Made for the glory of God. What could that possibly mean? The Bible starts by talking we're made in the very likeness of God. Well, to glorify something means to make it known. That's one definition anyway. And one way to make God known, if that was our purpose for living, is making God known, we could take that as we should all get up from our chairs and go stand out there and talk about God. Shout about God. But this passage isn't just talking about what we say. In fact, it's not even just talking about what we do. It's saying we are made. It's about our being. It's about who we are. Made for the glory of God. Our very existence. And so if we tie that back to the idea that we're made in the very likeness of God, this starts to say something about who we are, kind of spiritual DNA, if you will. If God is love itself, truth itself, and life itself, it says that we are built to be the place where that shines through. A little bit like you can't see the wind, but you can see the effect of the wind. You can't see love, can you? Or truth with your eyes. You can't say, oh, I see truth. But you can see truth expressed, right? You can see it made manifest in acts of honesty or love and acts of caring and kindness. So if we're it, if we're the act, if we're the effect of God, you can't see love, but you can see love made manifest. To me, the Bible is saying that's why we exist. We're love on legs. We are here to literally make manifest the truth of the universe, God, life itself. We're not our own little life. We're not our own even little independent intelligences. Is intelligences a word? But the source of all wisdom and intelligence gets expressed in us. Not in cookie-cutter kind of ways, because again, this source is infinite. So it has infinite ways of taking shape. Each individually, each creatively, each uniquely, but made to be the glory of God. To me, this is about our being, so it's not something we work our way up to. I have a 3-year-old little son. He's not earning his way up to it. He's not going to get there later. There isn't somebody who's been around now who's kind of retired from this. You know, like, well, I had a great career. I did a lot of good things. I was very loving. I was very creative, but now I'm just it's sort of in decline at this point. I mean, this is about our being, not about what we do. You don't grow into it. You don't retire out of it. You can't mess it up. It's a fact of existence in the lens that seems to be presented in the Bible. And what we see is that these people in these tough situations, it's something in regard to this relationship with God and what it means about them that dawns on them, that inspires them, that changes their outlook, which then has this tangible effect for good in their lives. These are not just happy thoughts. There's a cause and effect relationship between their perspective, rooted in the nature of God, and how things play out in their lives. But, okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. Cause and effect. Spirituality is not generally thought of as cause and effect. At best, it's often kind of put into the realm of positive thinking, right? At worst, it's been talked about as the opiate of the masses, as a way to control people or dumb people down, as a way of just sticking your head in the sand and pretending like nothing's wrong and, you know, nothing's going on and I don't need to do anything about it. But this is not the spirituality that we see in the Bible. The word spirituality comes from the word spirit. If God is spirit, then that which is spiritual is that which comes from God. Our spirituality is our existence, our being, flowing from this source. The spiritual perspective is one that stems from and flows from this perspective of what God is and what that means. So if spirituality isn't just positive thinking, if there's nothing wrong with being a positive person, right, or having positive thoughts, but that's not what you see in the Bible. You don't just see people having a positive thought about God and it changes nothing, and it does nothing, and they just continue to suffer. Instead, there's an effect. And so this, to me, is where the word discovery comes in. And I think this is really important to put this kind of prayer, this kind of spirituality in a light that is tied to the examples we see in the Bible. The word discovery, you know, what has progressed humanity throughout human history is discovery, right? If you think about, you know, whether it's the laws of aerodynamics or other things, a discovery means that something's already there. A discovery means that the people who found it, who learned about it, who understood it, didn't just make it up. And it means they didn't just think positively about it. You know, the Wright brothers, Santos Dumont, who was a fellow from Brazil who was living in France, who was working on aerodynamics around the same time as the Wright brothers. And there were a few others all around the same time. We hear about the Wright brothers, but there was a lot of people working out this issue, trying to understand these laws. None of them made up the laws. None of them were the proprietary creators of the laws, but they were trying to understand the laws of aerodynamics. They also, not one of them just went up to a tall hill and thought positively about flying. Just kind of, I have a good feeling about this today. You know, I'm feeling pretty positive. So it's not just a kind of made-up thought. Discovery is not a made-up thought. Discovery is something that happens when you begin to perceive and better understand what actually already is. Now, what actually already is may be different than what has been perceived previously. That's why we call it discovery. Often discoveries fly in the face of the way things have been perceived previously. Often they run very contrary to the way things appear to be on the surface. Didn't look like people could fly through the sky. And then somebody discovered the laws of aerodynamics. It ran contrary to the way people thought. It ran contrary to the way things looked. And yet, because it was rooted in something actual, real laws, there could be an effect that came from it. There could be a tangible effect. You could build on that in some way. So that to me is what discovery is about. Discovery has progressed humanity in so many different ways. Whether we talk about, like democracy, it was an idea. Previous to democracies, there was fiefdoms and tribes and kings and emperors. There was no appearance of equality necessarily. There had been, little stabs at it in kind of different ways throughout human history, but it was an idea that evolved over time. Didn't all happen in one swift moment, did it? The people's idea of what was right, what was just, how to govern, what works, what doesn't work, what's fair, was evolving over time. The idea of democracy was always there, and it could be, at some point culminated and demonstrated, and we're still working it out. It's not perfect. You think about human rights, it's the same deal. Think about women's rights. Discovery doesn't take something that's not true and make it true. It doesn't take people who can't fly and give them a new special power. It's not a miracle. It didn't happen with democracy. It didn't happen with women's rights either. It's not that women were unequal, and then one day somebody had the idea, well, let's think more positively about that and make them equal, right? And they went from not being equal to being equal. It's not like that. Women were always equal, and people began to better get that, better understand that, and then they built laws that reflected what had always been true, right? And again, like democracy, we're still working that one out. But there's been this evolution of the people's idea of what has actually always been true. These are discoveries. These are things that happen first in thought. They happen first in consciousness. And what's going on in thought, in perception, runs contrary to the way things appear to be, the way people are thinking, the way things have been done. And yet, because these kinds of ideas are rooted in what is true and actual and factual, in terms of just the nature of the universe, the laws of the universe, there can be an effect. When that idea is there, if it's just a positive thought, it can turn into a negative thought a day later. Right? Positivity, there's nothing wrong with being a positive person, but it comes and goes. A discovery is something that is already there, and it gets proved, and we tend not to go backwards, at least if we do, not for very long, because you can't really reverse a discovery. So, what happens when we start looking at spirituality through the lens of discovery? Not just positive thinking, not a tribal god up in the clouds who hooks some people up with good, allows suffering for other people, or uses bad to teach lessons, but a God that is pure good itself, a God that is the principle of the universe, that is the source of all life, therefore all health, and truth, therefore all justice, and love, therefore all kindness, and all caring. In essence, everything that matters to us, everything that our hearts beat for, everything that we yearn for. In my life, at the time in college, it was security, and it was value, and it was opportunity, and I was looking for it in another way. I was looking for it in a job, or in money, or in a course of study. And what I began to discover was that it didn't come from those things, that it came from this single, universal source. This was not, for me, just about my religion or about a new happy thought. This was not a positive spin on life. This was a discovery of something that was actually true, that our value is built into us, into our spiritual DNA, that we exist to make God known, that we don't exist to go get our good from somebody else or something else, but we exist to find it in our relationship with God and then express it, be the place where it shines through. And whatever our jobs are, whatever our relationships are, doesn't matter if we're the 3-year-old or the 300-year-old, or if we're driving down the street, or watching a program on TV, or any other thing. There's no break from this. There's no, as I said, retirement. There's no working it up. This is not something you get after a degree. It's the fact of our being. And it's such a big deal that, for me, it had a significant impact on my health and my well-being. It changed the whole course of my life, and it physically healed me. And this is, to me, what you see happening in the Bible too. This is not just positive thinking because it has this sweeping kind of impact on people's lives, just as any other major discovery in human history does. But this is happening on an individual level. The big discovery has already been done. Jesus kind of modeled it all for us. But we all have information that seems pretty contrary, right? Because we can talk about being made in the very likeness of God and having this purpose of existing for the very glory of God. And hopefully that sounds interesting. But let's take that step back again for a second. Back to like the opposite direction. How often does it look like that? When you wake up in the morning, is this the first thought that comes to you? Do you go, made for the glory of God? What a wonderful day. I'm here just to be the place where love shines through. Or do you start thinking about the stuff you have to do for your house and what's going on in your family and what's going on in the news? And maybe if you're like me and you use your phone as your alarm, you reach over and you grab your phone and you see the news alerts and you start checking your email, or you go downstairs and you get your oatmeal going and you flip on the TV. It doesn't matter where the source, whether it seems to be coming from our own to-do list or our own thoughts about things or from the news or anything else. What we're talking about being made for the very glory of God, it's not usually what we see, is it? Anyone here, do you wake up in the morning? Is this kind of how your day looks, made for the glory of God? Or does it look more like, something other than that? Yeah. Okay, so we all get this information. So when Jesus talks about the first part of prayer being about taking a step back from the surface appearance, the reactions, the fears, the preconceived notions, this is part of it. We can't just pretend that stuff isn't there. That's not the point. That would be the bury your head in the sand model. And to me, that's not what genuine spirituality is about again. What this teaches us, what we can discover, does run just completely contrary to the way things appear to be. But I guess the point is, I'm not sure we should be so surprised. And I definitely don't think we should be very concerned. Because again, that's what has progressed humanity always. It has always run in the face of how things appear to be. It doesn't mean there's not a logic to the way things seem to be. The idea is that if I go out into the cold, I could get sick, or if I have a fight with somebody, it means, that relationship might have trouble for a while, or, there's endless examples of that kind of way of looking at life. But now if I had a board back here and I wrote 7 plus 3 equals on it, 7 plus 3 equals, and I added those two together, 7 plus 3 together, what is the result? 73? I heard you all say 10, but why not 73? I mean, look at it, 7 plus 3. If you don't know the laws of math, if you don't actually know how math works, and you only have a surface logic, you have nothing but just kind of, you're told that the plus means you put them together. So 7 and 3, they go together. Doesn't that make a 73? I mean, isn't there at least a certain surface level logic to that? So to me, that's what was going on too with the counselor in high school. Your dad was like this, you went through this, therefore you're going to have and act like and feel like from here forward. And then I kind of pushed away from that, and I took a positive spin on it, but it was more just a positive thought, wasn't it? I didn't really discover where my good was coming from. The positive spin was still on the surface. It was a new surface appearance, it was a positive surface appearance, but it was still saying, if I get this, if I go to this school, if I get this kind of a job, then I'll have X, Y, Z. So whether it's a positive or a negative view, if it stays on the surface, on that surface level logic, it never really functions any more than 7 plus 3 is going to help you balance your checkbook or go grocery shopping or do anything else. You try and put that equation into practice and it gets uncomfortable pretty fast. Well, my life was getting uncomfortable because of this surface appearance of things. But like the folks we see modeling the way, to see God and think about ourselves in the Bible, I began to discover more about who we are. Think about the things that come to you, with those morning thoughts, or the afternoon, whatever, it doesn't matter. Maybe it's the stuff right before you go to bed, that seems to limit you. It seems to say, if only this, If only this would change. If only I could have that. And think about the surface level logic, and it tends to repeat, doesn't it? That kind of stuff. It comes to us all the time, it tends to repeat, and it feels very defining, it feels certain. We've seen plenty of other people that seem to have modeled that way of living. But pause now and take a step back. And think to yourself, what does it mean to be made in the very likeness of God? This might not be a new concept to those of you who have studied the Bible before, or studied Christian Science in particular. But it's a deep and infinite well. The idea of being made in the very likeness of all that is good, and of that being the very principle of the universe, meaning everything has that as its cause. Everything that is good and true, everything that is normal, everything that is functional, functions from that basis. And all the things that seem to function based on chaos or greed or any other thing, marketing, manipulation, are actually just how we've perceived our world to work, and perceived our relationships to work, and perceived our finances to work, and so on. And right in the face of that, every single one of us is built to see and know what is good and true. This is not, you don't have to join a group, you don't have to sign up for anything, you don't have to pay any money. It's either real or it's not real. It's either a fact of the universe or it's not. And it's really pretty comforting to start to see, take that step back, wait a second, this is freely given to me. This is built into me and built into everybody around me. These kinds of discoveries, they do run in the face of the way things seem to be. But to me, genuine spirituality is breaking down those perceived limitations, those perceived boundaries, and giving us a whole new foundation to problem solve from. We tend to look at the world and say, here's what I can do, here's what's possible, and then with the greatest heart and the greatest effort, even with prayer and so forth, if we don't challenge the basic assumptions, we work within the box. But before we do anything, prayer should help us step back and basically obliterate that box. Give us a different foundation to reason from. Give us a different starting point. If it feels heavy, if it feels stressful, if it feels like this is about self-help and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making it happen, or some special thing that you have that no one else has, then you can be sure that something has you thinking here. But that, again, that's not our fault, that's not normal to us, it feels uncomfortable for a reason, because it's not natural for us. So genuine spirituality helps us challenge that basis and obliterate that box. So let's go back now to Jesus as a model, as a way shower. Jesus, his last name wasn't Christ, right? Christ was a title. Christ was a title that's the Greek word. In Hebrew is Messiah, same basically word. It means anointed one. It has a relationship with another word in the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, Emmanuel, which means God with us. And it symbolizes that presence and that activity and that light and that power of God, of good, of love and truth itself, that shone through his life in such a brilliant and unique way in human history. But Jesus was on the planet for 33 years as far as we know. And the presence and the activity of life and love didn't start and end in 33 years, right? That's ongoing. It's always been part of existence. It's part of existence now. It's in this very room. It's throughout this community. The light of good, the presence and activity of God is an ever-present and eternal kind of a thing. But Jesus showed us something unique about grace, and my short one-phrase definition of grace is the unearned love of God. And that's, talking about busting things out of the box again, grace is just, I could talk for hours on grace, but grace is what puts all of this in its right context. Again, freely given, not earned, not if I do the right thing, if I think the right thing, if I cause it. But it's that dawning moment of a love that is so big and so all-defining, a love that is literally life itself and the cause of the universe, that it defines us, that we are the effect of it, not the other way around. It's not that we cause it if we do the right thing. It's the moment when we realize we are the cause. And so is everything that we think about in our lives. It puts everything in that lens. Jesus talked about salvation, which again in a very short phrase could be the dawning realization that nothing can separate us from this love of God. And the way that saves us, the way that that gives us a clear perception of our unbreakable relationship with this ongoing eternal life of God. So when we start looking at Jesus and what he modeled through this lens, we see this not as a compartmentalized thing that only applies to certain problems or certain people, any more than 7 plus 3 only applies to chairs, but not flowers. 7 plus 3 is 10 for anything, right? Anything. Well, when we talk about the source of all good, of all balance, and of all harmony, and of all strength, and of all wisdom, and literally all that is good, that doesn't mean for your relationships but not your health. It doesn't mean for your workplace but not for your finances. It doesn't mean for some people and not others. If it's a rule or a principle of the universe, it applies to everything. It is also, as we've been talking about, universal for everybody. Timeless, we've talked about. Well, these are the kinds of characteristics of a science. And this is what Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of this movement, the Christian Science movement, felt was a unique discovery on her part. Was a way of looking at the life and the teachings and the example and the love and the healing of Christ Jesus, and saying that if there's anything true there, whatever that truth is, it has to be universal. It has to be timeless. It's not that 7 plus 3 was 10 2,000 years ago and slipping a little bit towards 10.1 these days. It's either a fact or it's not. The other thing about a science, though, it's timeless, universal, but it's also understandable and provable. There's no mystery to something that's a science. Often we look at God that way and we say, okay, I like these thoughts, they make me feel good, but how do I apply that to the rest of my life? Well, maybe I'll find out when I die. Or maybe I'll find out if I become somebody special, or I go to the right person and ask them to give me their wisdom. We don't think that way about a science. We don't think that way about math, right? We know that any one of us can go to math class and learn the principles of math. We know, too, that when you get your math test, blind faith isn't going to do it. Right? If you get that math test, you cannot write on it in just blind faith. I love math. I believe in math. I know there's an answer to all these equations. Hallelujah, and then turn it in. A lot of good, wonderful things have happened in the name of faith throughout human history. There's been some not so good things that have happened in the name of faith. But I think there's a difference between blind faith and faith based on understanding. To talk about a Christian science, or a science of Christ, is to, again, look at what Jesus modeled and say, this has to be for everyone, and because it's for everyone, it has to be understandable. It can't be a mystery. What Jesus modeled isn't something I just have to believe in blindly, but I can understand it. And even if I don't understand it all, I can pursue that knowledge, that capacity to apply what is true to the equations of my life too. And just like math, when you get the math test, if you make a mistake, you don't necessarily take it personally. You don't think, I broke math, it doesn't apply to me, I need to go to a special guru so they can bless me so that it'll work for me. We know that it's just, we already have access to it. That access is already there, that truth is unwavering. We just need to understand it a little more. And as we understand it more, we get the right answers to the equations. And we keep working at it until we do. So to talk about a Christian science is to look at Christianity through this lens in this really unique way and say, I can apply what Jesus modeled to the equations of my life too. That's actually what it was about. When Jesus came, he talked about the gospel, and the word gospel simply means good news. And this is the best news. The best news is not that it's coming later. You know, like, that wouldn't be that good. If somebody says, I have a hug for you, I love you, it's on layaway, and you can have it in 30 years. How loved do you really feel? Love that feels as loving as love can be, good that feels as good can be, is free, it's now, it's understandable, it's practical, it's palpable, and that is the good news. When Jesus was asked about the kingdom of heaven, when's it going to come? What's it going to look like? He said, it's not something you're going to see coming. It's not over here or over there. It's within you. And he said, the works that I do, you will do also. So there's this promise that every single one of us can understand this, can feel this, can prove in the face of the stuff that tempts all of us to think and feel something very different, that we can make these discoveries and that we can prove more of that kingdom of truth and love and life, of pure good right here and right now. Not in a compartmentalized way, but in every aspect of our lives. So Mary Baker Eddy, she experienced significant healing in her life as she discovered more about this. Chronic illness from the time she was a little girl, as well as the effects of a severe accident. As she began to understand more, she was helping others, she was teaching others, and they were finding healing in their lives, and they were helping others. They were essentially just spreading the good news. And that's how a movement was born. This was never about one person. It became a Christian Science movement because people started finding that anybody can practice this themselves and saw the light that it shed on the scriptures and their own lives by looking at things from this perspective. Mary Baker Eddy wrote this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. The last 100 pages of this book are all stories of people who wrote in who talked about significant transformation, significant healing, many times of things that were diagnosed as incurable, simply by reading the book. Not because they went to somebody else and needed, other help, but because it helped them discover more about their direct relationship with God and how to prove that in their lives. Mary Baker Eddy started a church, but the church was never a place where you go to get God. It was a place where you go to work with others who were learning and growing in the same way, and where you could do more together for your collective community than you would be able to do on your own. All of this was something that Mary Baker Eddy felt was also part of what Jesus promised. Remember, he talked about, you'll do the works that I do. Well, he also talked about the Comforter. It's translated different ways in different Bibles. Sometimes it's helper, sometimes it's advocate, but what we know is how Jesus defined it. He said this Comforter, or whatever word you want to use, is the Spirit of truth. And he said it will guide you into all truth, explain all things, and help you remember what I've done. So, to Mary Baker Eddy, this was the fulfillment of something that was very natural, that was part of Christianity from the beginning. That this Spirit of truth, this idea of how to understand and look at what Jesus taught in a way that helps explain it, not take it out of the box of mystery, take it out of the box of just for some people sometimes, and make it a comprehensible science, a universal, understandable, provable way of looking at life and experiencing God right here and now. That was for everybody. She started some magazines, a weekly and a monthly, where people could write in and talk about the significant healing they were finding. Everyday people could write in. Because it's not showing up on the news alerts, and it can seem pretty distant and pretty separate from life, these are sources where we can see that this is actually going on a lot more than sometimes it seems like it is, and we can be part of that. She also started a news source, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. She was 89 years old when she started this news source, the Christian Science Monitor. Now, we talk about spirituality is about busting out of the box. Well, there's a box for you. How many people, again, wake up in the morning and think, 89, I should start a new newspaper today. But she saw a need. She saw a need for people to understand accurately what's going on in the world so that spirituality could not be abstract, could not be just something you bury your head in the sand and it makes you feel good while the ship sinks, but so that we can understand, with the idea of bringing healing to the world, what's going on, where the points of progress are, what's needed in order to bring more progress. This news source, this Christian Science Monitor, I'm going to tell you a story about Nelson Mandela at the end. and his relationship with the monitor too. But her life really proved what happens when any of us build on a principle that's universal, not on the limited ideas about who we are, and most abstract possible words. If you were to take a word that is the opposite of spirit, what would that word be? You have spirit on the one hand, and on its opposite you have what?
Matter.
Matter? Good. Well, pretty universal chorus. This side's winning, though. Just kidding. Spirit and matter. Okay, now, if I told you one of those things is pretty abstract and the other one's not, one of those things, in fact, I would say we could define one of them as substantial, solid, tangible, practical, and the other one is just a concept. Now, which one would you say is which? Is spirit the solid, substantial, present, practical, or how does that go? I think most of us, the general impression is spirit sounds like this kind of ethereal, out there kind of a deal. But if we come back and we look at spirit again through the lens of what Jesus talked about, as a presence, as a power, of the fleshed out view that we see in the Bible, of all good itself, and then we think about things we care about. Think about what is most substantial to you in life. Think about what your heart yearns for. Think about what the world needs. It's always going to be practical. It's not going to be the far off stuff, right? It's always going to be something practical. It's always going to be something beautiful. It's always going to be something just. It's always going to be something honest. It's always going to be something useful, right? It's always going to be something intelligent or wise. If we look at all of these things as the characteristics of God, of spirit, then the things that we care about most, that is most substantial, most real, most practical, we start, maybe that word starts to take on a little bit different hue. It begins to feel more like the life that we want, the life that when we're feeling uplifted and cared for, we can be part of. Life in and of spirit. A spirit that is the tangible good of the universe. Universally. The universe universally. And then matter. What in the world, how could we call matter just a concept? Isn't matter what we say is the substance of the universe? How could you look at it that way? Well, let's talk about it like this. I would say matter is like, or materialism, or a material perspective, is a way of looking at spirit. Spirit is what is solid, what is real, what is tangible, what is good, what is practical, and then there's the way we see it. We see it through a distorted lens. We see it through this material perspective. Matter is a concept, a way of looking at spirit in a limited way. It's like the asterisk or the fine print on life. You know those commercials, whether it's a cell phone commercial or like a drug commercial where they have the happy bouncing ball, and then at the end it's like, may cause bleeding, suffering, death, hives, whatever. That's the fine print, right? In the cell phone contract, it's like all the stuff that follows here's your great new phone, and then, everything after. We look at life and we see good, don't we? We look at ourselves and we see good. We know that. We say, maybe I have some humor, or you say, maybe I'm kind generally. But then there's always this asterisk or fine print, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It comes and it says, yeah, but may suffer or, be stupid sometimes. It's the way we look at men and we say, they're creative and compassionate, but they can be, controlling or hateful. It's the way we look at women and we say powerful and intelligent, but can be just an object or weak. It's the way we look at young people and we say civic-minded world changers, but could be violent at any time. It's that asterisk or fine print that comes, whether it's the way we look at politicians or anything else. That's the mixed together view of life. It says there's good and evil together. And this is how Paul put it in the Bible. It's from the book of 1 Corinthians. It says, now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And this is from another translation, same passage. Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. So despite all the fine print, the asterisks, that other information that says, yeah, you see good, but there's this other stuff mixed in, that regular narrative, there's this idea that, yeah, that's like a distorted lens, kind of like in a clown house. You look at those mirrors that make you really tall or really wide or really wobbly. And if you go in and you're wearing an orange shirt and a purple hat, you're going to see in that wobbly mirror some purple and orange coming out, but you see all this other stuff mixed in. It's an imperfect view, but the spiritualization of thought, that this spiritual discovery is about seeing ourselves more as God now sees us, as we actually are. This stuff, no matter how much it bombards us, it never changes the facts. It never changes reality. It never changes who we are. It doesn't matter if we seem to have experienced it for the longest time. Every limitation that's ever limited humanity went on for a long time until we caught a new view. You can take a mirror and put it in a drawer for 20 years, but the second you pull it out and you point it towards the sun, it will reflect the light, because it's built for that. We are built to reflect the good of God. Everything that God is built into our nature. Everything that God is built into the nature of our communities, the nature of life. And whatever information says to the contrary is that wobbly, distorted lens. It's a concept. It's a concept of life, a perspective of life. But a perspective doesn't change things, right? Perspective is just a view. And a perspective can change in a moment. It can reflect more of what's true when there's a discovery of the facts of reality that are unchanged by a distorted perspective. The Bible is so beautiful because it starts by saying we're made in the likeness of God, and then it's practical. It does not just leave it there. It says, made in the likeness of God. Now let me tell you why it doesn't feel that way. And many of you will know the story. I take it as an allegory, meaning not something that happened thousands of years ago, but something that is about our lives every day. These two characters have everything good. Their names are Adam and Eve. And they're told not to eat from this one tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge, though. Knowledge of good and evil, right? So we're talking about ideas. We're talking about thoughts. We're talking about a concept. Everything is good. Don't take on that knowledge. They eat from it, and those of you who know the story, what's the first thing that they feel? Guilt? Yeah. Shame? Yeah. So those thoughts that say we have a life of being a cause outside of pure good, outside of God itself, they do cause that feeling of guilt or shame or limitation. Those characters, the next thing is they feel kicked out of the garden of good. And like it's normal to suffer and struggle and fight for good. So to me, the Bible is saying when it starts to feel like that, when that's the lens through which we seem to be seeing life, take a step back and ask yourself what we're accepting as knowledge. What are we accepting as the base facts of what life is about? Every single one of us can do this. Again, grace is that love of God that empowers us. It says, I don't care how much this has repeated itself. I don't care how much it feels limiting or scary or frustrating or sorrowful. That sorrow, that frustration, that limitation cannot redefine you or anybody else. It shows us who we are. It lifts us up to see that about ourselves. So we're talking about consciousness, but this is not about the manipulation of our own or anyone else's consciousness. I had a man call me one time, and he said he had wanted help with his grandson. He had had a really tight relationship with his grandson from the time he was a little kid. The grandson was 17 years old, and he was at his house, his mother's house, and something came up in the news. And it was a difficult, divisive issue, racially charged issue. And the grandfather's response was, appalling to the 17-year-old grandson. He just couldn't understand where he was coming from. And whatever the grandfather did to try and make it better and explain himself, the grandson wanted nothing to do with it. And even though they'd been best buddies for years, after that the grandson wouldn't talk to him anymore. It had been a year. He was calling me now and he was saying, what can I do? Can I pray about this? And so we said, okay, let's take a step back for a second. First, let's get a better view of this issue, what came up in the news. Try and understand where your grandson's coming from. What do you think is behind this? What do you think is behind the feelings of frustration and injustice that have been there, the even anger, that is boiling up because of this? I was praying with him, and we were talking about how to get beneath those initial perceptions or the way he'd seen things for a long time. Not that he had to change his view, but just to try and get a deeper view of what makes us who we are and what makes things fair. And within a day, there was I would call it a character transformation, but if nothing else, it was just a new, radically different view of his community and his world, where there had been a lack of compassion and understanding before. Suddenly this man kind of woke up and went, oh, I get it. I get where the fear and frustration is coming from. And his heart just kind of lit on fire. What can I do about it? Was the next question. His biggest concern, he'd almost forgotten about his grandson, is how do I help? I want to make a difference. So then we talked about how prayer leads us to paths that make a difference. We talked about how it's not about running out and changing people, but that he could discover more about the power of justice where injustice seemed to be. So that was the natural course of things, that there was nothing built into any human being ever in all of history, ever, that forced anyone or made anyone inherently cruel or ignorant or greedy, any more than there was inherently built into anyone the susceptibility or the vulnerability to someone else or anything else or a system to take away their good, be the gatekeeper of good, and cut off their direct relationship with good. That he could see everyone wrapped up in this universe of love itself, of a divine principle ordering things and supplying all good to all people. That this was not just a happy thought, but he could begin to literally perceive the presence of that as true. As he did that, he began to feel a much greater peace. We talked about how sometimes your prayer and the light that brings to the situation is enough. Other times it leads you to new ideas about how to act and what to do, as it led, for example, Mary Baker Eddy to an action to create an international newspaper. We don't have to work that part out. The wisdom to know how to think or act or talk comes with the right perspective. But then we came, oh, and by the way, he got so excited in this time frame. He wrote me and he said, I had a physical healing. He didn't tell me what it was. He was more interested in his new worldview. But he said, in the process, I had a physical healing of something. Well, I wrote him back when I asked if I could share a story, and I said, I'm looking through our email threads, and you said something physically changing you. What was that? And he said, I don't even remember at this point. So it's kind of an aside, but to me it was significant. But in the end, he came back to his grandson. He said, what do I do about this relationship? How do I go and convince him that, I'm seeing things in a way that maybe he can respect? And again, we had to revisit the idea that prayer is not about changing other people. It's not about forcing your view on them. It's not about convincing anyone of anything. It's definitely not about manipulating people and getting them to see something your way. It's about changing your view of what's already true. It's about discovering what is already true. He could see more of his grandson in the way that God had already made him to be, in the very likeness of God, full of love, full of compassion, full of his own feeling of being safe himself, and of the people he cared about as also having a direct relationship with good. He could see that that was already there. And so he said he would pray along those lines. Well, he called me like about a month or so later. And he said the first time he'd been able to go over to his grandson's house after that, it was completely different. He said it was like a 180-degree view. The relationship was totally repaired. They were back to being best buddies again. And it's been, I don't know, about 2 years now. And he wrote me about 3 months ago and said, it's still going along. So there was a genuine transformation, not just within him, but his grandson. And the idea, again, is that spirituality is not just our little self-help tool. This widens our view. It embraces everybody. And our thoughts, when they're transparency for truth has the power. Not people over other people. Truth itself is like light, and light lightens the darkness. It changes false concepts, materialistic views, views that are limiting, views that say, if you do this, this will happen, in that surface level logic kind of a way, whether that's psychology or biology or politics or anything else. If it doesn't align with the nature of God, then it is a concept, a limited view of what's true. And our spiritual discoveries help us get beneath the surface of that. And the truth itself sheds light on the issue. The truth itself makes adjustments in people's view, and therefore in people's lives. Even, again, in health and well-being. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to kind of wrap up, but I want to just expand this now. I told you we'd talk about how this betters the world, and hopefully you're already connecting the dots, but I want to talk specifically about the world for a moment. Because for whatever reason, and I get the reason, when we go to pray about something bigger than just ourselves or somebody that we know, it starts to feel a little different. Anyone here ever try to pray for your community or for the world, some issue going on in the world? Anybody? Okay. Does anyone ever wonder if your prayers do any good? Okay. So here's the deal, and here's why I want to pause on this for just a moment. When we pray for ourselves or somebody else and there's a transformation, we can see that. It's a lot easier to see the cause and effect relationship between a spiritual perspective and the healing that that brings. When we go to pray about some issue on the other side of the globe, it's really hard to know, right? You may pray about something in the news and you may see things get better the next week, or you may see them get worse, and there's no way to really know on a surface level, is there, what effect prayer may be having. So here's what I think is really useful. Here's a new math analogy for you. We've done 7 and 3 equals 10 for a little while. We're going to change it up. We're going to do 3 and 3 equals 6. And this time there's no trick question. But we're going to expand 3 and 3 equals 6 to 3 trillion and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion. Anyone doubt that? No. We've all proved that 3 and 3 equals 6 before on some level. Anyone ever proved what a trillion of anything looks like? Do you know anyone, if I asked you a trillion grains of sand, 6 trillion grains of sand, would it fill up this hall or the city block? Does anyone have an idea? Okay. Most of us don't know. I have, in fairness, had a physicist in my audience who knew the answer to that same question before. That's just an analogy, though, because empirically speaking, that is, just from the surface appearance of things, what we can measure, most of us just can't really conceive of what trillions of something look like. And yet we know with with total scientific certainty, that 3 trillion and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion. So with no surface appearance, no way to prove it on that level, we know because of the principle behind it. We know because we can prove the principle on any scale. 3 and 3 equals 6. We might be able to see that one, but we can prove the principle on any scale. Well, when we go to pray about our community, when we go to pray about the globe, we tend to, again, just start with that surface appearance of things. And it looks like there's a million, maybe billions of moving parts. And when we start there, it's hard to get much deeper. But I have an experience. I was in finance, and we would watch a jobs report come out. It would say something like 200,000 new jobs created this quarter. And that day, the market would go down. Why? Because people were expecting 300,000 new jobs. So if we look at the economy that day, and let's say we were going to pray about the economy that day. You could pray about the number of widgets built, imported, exported, what the Fed set the rate at, And yet, you'd sort of be missing things, wouldn't you? What's the factor? What was the real factor at work that day in what caused the market to go down in that moment?
Perception.
Perception. Sure. What is it? Expectations. Yeah. Disappointment. Something like that. People expected 300,000 new jobs. They got 200,000 new jobs. So their expectations weren't met. What is that? That's a mental characteristic that's not so foreign to us. We've all dealt with that. We've all dealt with disappointment. We've all dealt with our expectations not being met. That's not like widgets built and imported and exported. We don't have to be economists to understand how to deal with that mental element of disappointment or expectations not being met. And that day, at least at that moment, that was the primary factor that affected the market. Now, it's not to oversimplify things, but it is to say that in any situation, in any case, we are always able to get beneath the millions of moving pieces, the players involved, the personalities, the history, and start to boil it down. And when you get down to the very base element of things, you start to find that it comes down to the same mental elements every time. The same mental elements, that is, that we deal with in our individual lives. Just like 3 trillion and 3 trillion boils down to 3 and 3, and it's the same, that principle we can prove. Well, if we can prove what it takes to overcome disappointment, if we can prove that a bigger sense of where good comes from gives us stability, if we can prove that a better understanding of love overcomes greed, if we can prove that health coming from an infinite source that is freely given helps us overcome sickness. If we can prove that justice can overcome injustice, then we're proving the same mental elements that are right at the heart of everything, right? Groups that have been warring with each other for generations. What does it come down to? What are the resentments, the fears, the concerns involved? It's ultimately always the same stuff that we deal with either in our own families or our own workplaces or our own communities. It might be happening on a different kind of a scale, but it's the same mental elements because the human nature is human nature. The human mind and its perception, its limited way of looking at things, is the same thing every single time. So, you know, like I knew a man who lived in West Berlin and was traveling regularly to East Berlin, and he talked about how before the wall came down, you could feel a change. There was a mental shift happening, and it was nothing you could see on the surface. Except for right before the wall came down, there were these prayer groups that got together by candlelight and had held vigils. Well, after the wall came down, there was this high-ranking Stasi agent who said, "We were prepared for everything but candles and prayers." So if you were to pray about that issue, on the most surface level, you might pray about how many tons of concrete are in the wall. I mean, that would be really kind of an ignorant, sort of very, very surface level. You get a little deeper and you might be talking about the ideologies and the people and the personalities behind what was going on at the time and the decision makers at the time. But if you get even beneath that, the very thoughts, the very mental elements that were at the heart of those kinds of decisions and worldviews, it's the same stuff that divides people right in our own communities. You know, Gandhi said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Well, this is more than just make your little world better. Like, we talk about that, and that's a good thing. Do your part, make things better. But this is about consciousness. This is not just about what we do, this is about who we are. This is about what truth is, what actually governs everything. These views that embrace all humanity, the brotherhood, the sisterhood of man. You know, when we see what a shift in perspective can do in our own relationships, when truth itself sheds light and that brings a tangible difference, that begins to show us how that same kind of prayer, that same kind of light shed on even a global thing, a community thing, can make a difference because it's handling the same mental elements. Does that make sense? Mental elements are at the heart of everything. Before someone creates a job, they have to have an idea to do it. Before someone makes an action in government, they have to have a thought process. we often just judging by the surface appearance. My last little example is about President de Klerk of South Africa. He was the one who was elected on the apartheid ticket, believed in it, his party believed in it, and somebody said to me it was like he went to bed one night believing apartheid was right and woke up one morning knowing it was wrong. Speaking to a South African reporter whose brother was also a reporter and had met with de Klerk multiple times, he said it wasn't an overnight deal. That's like just a real simplification of the story. But there was a shift in perspective. Mental elements. How does that happen? Why does it happen? Just new views dawning on people. Shifting points of view. This is what has transformed the course of human history again and again and again. What is mental is not abstract. It's quite the other way around. What is mental is right at the root of absolutely everything. And if it's mental based in falsity, if it's mental based in a limited concept, it's flexible. It comes and it goes. But if it's mental rooted in a discovery of the rules of the universe, of how things actually work, it's impenetrable. It's light, and it makes a change for the better. So Nelson Mandela, I told you I'd come back to him. 6 months after he was released, he came to Boston because Boston, he had found out, was the home of the anti-apartheid movement. When he was there, he found out that the Christian Science Monitor was published in Boston, and it wasn't on his itinerary, but he asked to go and see it. So he shows up on the Christian Science Plaza where the Monitor staff work, and where I think probably at the time the Monitor was actually printed. Somebody runs to grab the editor, the staff come out, and they interview him. And in this interview, I'm going to just read you what was said. He talked about how the Monitor had been one of the more important voices covering events in South Africa, and that it was well known to him in his 27 years in prison because it was the only international newspaper he'd been allowed to read in prison, although certain parts had been redacted. And what was quoted was, he says, "It continues to give me hope and confidence for the world's future." After that, he wanted a tour of the church because he said, "I had to see the interior of the church that has had such an impact on the people of Black Africa." And when he was done with the tour, he said, the reporter said he marveled that a woman not only started this paper, but this religion. So, coming back to what it takes to make change. Here's Mary Baker Eddy, 89 years old. She gets a perspective. She gets a perspective of what's needed. She gets a perspective of what allows something to happen, something good to happen, like the creation of an international newspaper. The power is not in a person, it's not in a body, it's not in any other perceptions of how things work. Women couldn't even vote at the time, let alone start a business or a newspaper. None of those perceptions factored into what was right and what needed to happen. Her life is an example of someone who acted from this bigger sense of principle. Well, we see how that ripples out. We see how somebody, generations later, is impacted. Somebody like Nelson Mandela, not because of a person, but because of the principle, because of what was behind it. So when we go to pray for our communities, for our country, for the world, we can take that step back just as we can in our own individual lives. From all those surface level moving parts to get right at the heart of the same things that bring healing for us. We can know that the principle behind that ripples out and it has power, even down through time. I'm going to read you these last two lines, one from the Bible. This is again from Paul. He wrote, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." So we're not waiting. This isn't something down the road. Discoveries aren't about a miracle that's going to happen later or something we're earning or working our way up to. This salvation, this discovery that nothing can separate us from the love of God, is something that dawns on us right now, moment by moment, on your drive home, every morning. We look for it, and the Bible says, look and you'll find. It's freely given, and it's all defined. Mary Baker Eddy said this in Science and Health. She starts with the word science. She's talking about the science of Christ. She said, "Science reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done." This is the best news in the world, that it's already done. That whatever would say otherwise is something we can challenge. That this isn't just self-help, it's not just about feeling good. It's about what is normal and natural, that is, the very nature of God being felt, experienced, and shining through in our own lives. The more we understand about God, the more significant that is, and the more we see that it's kind of a big wow that that's what we're here to be, and that translates into what we do and what we say. Jesus said, "You're the light of the world," and you are. And I want to thank all of you for being you, for being what God has made you to be. Each of us here matters. Each of us is here for a reason. It's pretty significant that the very nature of God shines through us. That's not a little thing. That's not just a theological point. That's the depth of our value is rooted in that. And wherever we go, whatever we do next, the more we see that shining through, the more we feel the freedom of it, and the more it helps free others to feel that too. So thank you for being that, but thank you for also taking the time to think about that here tonight and join together and just be part of this thought process. Have a great night. If you don't have one, there's a copy of the Bible in the back. There's also a copy of Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health, The Key to the Scriptures. It's a different cover, but it's the same book. And there are copies of the various magazines that I mentioned too, up-to-date versions that are back there. Have a great night. I'll stick around if anyone wants to chat. Take care.